How's it going? Welcome to another video lecture. What we're going to talk about for this one has to do specifically with California, and we're actually going to go back in time a little bit. I felt it was important that before we get to the Civil War and things like that, that we talk a little bit about the background and history of California. I'm not sure if that's something you covered before I took over as your teacher, but anyway, the question for this is going to be, how were Native Americans in California treated under the mission system? Let's step back and talk about the mission system. The mission system was set up by lots of Catholic nations, particularly Spain, in the 1500s into the 1800s. And the point of the mission was to go to foreign lands, set up the mission, which was an actual building, and you were supposed to convert the people who lived in that area to Christianity. And most of the time, this is done with Native Americans. If you go to Florida, if you go to Mexico, if you go to South America, if you go to the Caribbean, and if you go to parts of California, you will see old missions. And they were built primarily by the Spanish, and they were trying to convert the Native Americans in that area to Catholicism. Sometimes it worked. More often than not, it didn't work, but it was meant to evangelize the people that were there. And it's a mixed bag. Sometimes Native Americans decided to convert to Catholicism, and other times they didn't. So what we're going to try and figure out is, under this mission system, how are they actually treated? I want to look at a timeline here. So let's look at the timeline, then we'll look at two images, then we are going to look at four documents that are relatively short, not as long as the ones we normally do. So, timeline, California missions and Native Americans. 1760. Now understand, the Spanish get to the, quote, New World or North America in the 1500s. Cortez comes and conquers the Aztecs and makes that Mexico in the 1500s. But we're going to start with 1760. Population of Native Americans in California was approximately 300,000 in 1760. Now, one thing you got to understand is that California was part of what was called New Spain. It wasn't part of Mexico yet. That's going to happen way later. And then subsequently, it'll become part of the United States after that. 1769, Junipero Serra founded a mission, San Diego, the first of 21 Spanish missions built in California. 1771, in one of the first acts of resistance by native Californians against the mission system, Tongva leaders attacked the San Gabriel mission in response to Spanish soldiers' violence against Tongva women. So the Native Americans who lived here in California actively rebel against this mission system, and they don't like what the Spanish soldiers are doing to them. I didn't mention that before. When I said there were missions here, it wasn't just nuns and friars and priests. There were Spanish soldiers here because obviously Spain was occupying this territory. 1821, Mexico gained independence from Spain, and California becomes part of Mexico. 1823, the final mission to convert Native Americans was established in Sonoma. 1834, mission lands were given to private families. That's interesting because what that means is, as the Spanish had left, the mission lands that they had left over, people were saying, well, whose land is this now? So the Mexican government decides to just give that to private families, which I say probably wasn't a smart move. They probably should have, given that land equitably or evenly to different people, but instead they gave it to private families, usually ones that happen to be wealthy and would just make more wealth out of having more land. 1845, California missions were sold at public auction, so further continuation of that. And then 1845, the Native American population in California was approximately 150,000. So from 1845, go back to 1760, so in less than 100 years, the Native American population in California is cut in half. That is not good for the Native Americans in this area. So where you live, whether it's San Pedro or somewhere else in Southern California, you live in an area that was colonized by the Spanish first, then was colonized by Mexico or was part of Mexico, and is now part of the United States. And in that time, Native Americans have seen their population cut in half. So right off the bat, that gives us some idea about how Native Americans were treated, but we don't know for sure if the Native American population was cut in half for bad reasons or for, circumstantial reasons, for natural reasons. So let's try and find out. I want you to take a look at this picture. Now, let me give you some background on this picture. The name of this, it's really a painting, I guess, is Mission Solano de Sonoma, 1884. Oriana Weatherby, an artist who moved from Massachusetts to California in 1877, made this painting of the Mission Solano de Sonoma in 1884. Between 1867 and 1884, she painted all 21 of the California missions. The paintings were commissioned by Dr. Platon Vallejo, son of the General Mariano Vallejo, who served as a military commander while California was part of Mexico. During his time as a commander, he crushed several native Californian revolts. Mariano Vallejo lost most of his land to Americans after California was annexed, that means absorbed or taken over, by the United States. The Vallejos planned to use Weatherby's paintings to illustrate a book they were writing about the history of California, but the book was never finished. Okay, so when you look at this painting, you see people standing around a fire, and you see them in the mission. You can tell because there's a big cross on that building over there, and this is what missions looked like. I gotta tell you, there's not much we can really tell from this picture. We see people with dark hair, so I assume those people are Native Americans. We see some people sitting on the ground, and then we see one person with a staff on the right and a headdress, maybe with feathers, whether he's leading a ceremony or not. I gotta tell you, this painting doesn't really help us answer our question too much because I can't really tell if there's anything good or bad going on. This doesn't look good or bad. So this is almost like a neutral photo. So I'm not going to say one way or the other that this is good or bad. Let's go to the next image. I only have two for you. This is San Francisco Presidio, 1816. Now this painting was created by Louis Choris in 1816. Choris was a German-Ukrainian artist who traveled to Northern California as part of a Russian expedition in 1816. He made several drawings and paintings of the expedition. Well, this is a little bit different because when you look at this painting, and by the way, this person was actually there. The person in the last painting wasn't there. This person was actually there when missions were going on. You see people dressed in blue. I guess they're like soldiers, Spanish soldiers, and they've got weapons. They're on horseback. And they seem to be leading Native Americans who look like they're wrapped up in chains. And they look like they're almost like whipping these Native Americans, which would imply some cruelty. So this, if I'm going by this, and this person was actually there, he would say Native Americans were treated cruelly based on the way that they're chained, almost like slaves, and that they're being, it looks like, if you look in the left, just in front of the actual mission building, it looks like they're being whipped or something like that. So, out of these two images, I guess you could say one was kind of neutral. Maybe that one was trying to say it was good. I don't know. I mean, it was like a meeting place, but it was kind of vague. Whereas that second one doesn't look so good. It doesn't look like it was nice to live there. So, now that we've looked at those two images, one that was made way after California missions, the first one, and one that was made during it, let's look into some documents and see if we can figure out how Native Americans were actually treated. So go to document A here, Helen Hunt Jackson. Helen Hunt Jackson was a novelist who wrote about California Americans in the 1880s. In one of her books, she wrote a positive description of life in the missions. She did this in part to contrast the early mission period of California to the brutal treatment of Native Americans in the decades after California became part of the United States. Below is an excerpt from the book. Okay. Let's see what she has to say. Now remember, this woman wasn't actually like there. So this is like what she's heard in stories. And she wrote a positive description. So why does she do this? Well, she's trying to sort of contrast the early part of the missions in California to the brutal treatment of Native Americans after California had already become part of the United States. Things are only going to get worse with Native Americans when the United States gets involved. Okay, let's see what she says. There was little active hostility on the part of the savage tribes. Okay, right there, hostility means unfriendliness or opposition, and she's already referring to Native Americans as savage tribes. So, all right, we're off to a great start. They looked kindly to the ways and restraints of the new life. This is the strongest possible proof that the methods of the friars in dealing with them must have been wise and humane. Now, restraints, to restrain means to keep something under control. So a restraint is something that does that keeps something under control. They said they look kindly to the ways and restraints of the new life. Okay. And then they go on to say, this is proof that the methods of the friars in dealing with them must have been wise and humane. Wise obviously meaning intelligent or smart, and humane meaning kind and gentle. So she's saying, okay, well, based on what we see out of Native Americans, they took kindly to the ways that the friars were teaching them, so this must suggest that what the friars did was right or smart. Okay. The rules of the friars was in the main kind. No doubt there were individual instances of cruelty. Absolute control of hundreds of human beings could not exist without some abuse. But the Indians on the whole, were on the whole well treated and cared for. The fact that so many thousands of them chose to remain in the missions is proof. Okay, so what they're saying is you can't have control of so many people without some level of abuse. It's like if you have a school like with 3,000 kids in it, there are going to be kids who get in trouble. There are going to be kids who break the rules. That's just the way it is when you have a large group like that. It's just going to happen. But she's saying, well, in order to control those people, we have to have some discipline. We have to have abuse. I don't know that you have to have abuse, just because you have a school with 3,000 kids. The kids who act up, that doesn't mean you have to hurt them or abuse them. You might have to instill some discipline, but you don't have to hurt them. And then they say she says the Indians were well treated and cared for. The fact that so many of them chose to remain on the missions is proof. That's interesting. She's saying they chose to stay on the missions, but really, what choice did they have? That's worth keeping in mind. Okay, keep reading. The picture of life in one of these missions during their period of prosperity is attractive. The whole place was a hive of industry. Work indoors and outdoors, planters, herders, children in schools, women spinning, bands of young men practicing on musical instruments. At evening, all sorts of games, running, leaping, dancing, and ball throwing. So that last bit, she's saying everything that happens on the missions is fun and positive and enriching. It's a good thing. So if you ask Helen Hunt Jackson how were Native Americans treated on these missions, she's going to say they were treated well, that the friars were good to them. There were lots of great things happening there. They chose to stay there. But even she admits there was a level of abuse. Are you okay with abuse when people act up? That's something you have to ask yourself here. Because if we just say, well, no abuse towards anyone, then you might see someone breaking the rules and you think, well, okay, they've got to be disciplined. But I think there's a difference between discipline and abuse. Setting someone straight and abusing someone are not the same thing. And I think she's excusing the amount of abuse that's there. So just keep that in mind. If you ask her, though, Helen Hunt Jackson, document A, she's going to say Native Americans were treated well. No ifs, ands, or buts. Okay? Go to document B, Hugo Reed. Hugo Reed was a Scottish-born citizen of Mexico who lived in Los Angeles in the 1830s. Okay, so unlike the last document, he actually lived in Los Angeles during the time period of missions. Reed was married to a Native American woman of the Tongva tribe named Victoria. He wrote a series of newspaper letters describing the Tongva people. Below is an excerpt from one of the letters about living conditions in the San Gabriel mission. So this guy is Scottish, born in Mexico, but he's married to a Tongva woman. So his perspective is very interesting, and he was there at the time. So keep that in mind. Okay. Indians, of course, deserted. Now, to desert means to leave or run out on. So he's saying Native Americans deserted the missions. They ran out of the missions. They left. Who would not have deserted? Those who had hard times of it. If they went on to other missions, they were picked up immediately, flogged, and put in irons until they were returned to undergo other flagellations. So to flog means to beat somebody with a whip or a stick, and flagellations means whippings. So if they tried to escape the mission and they were caught at another mission or just running away, they would be flogged, meaning whipped, put in irons, which means put in chains, and then they would be returned only to be whipped some more. Okay. The padre, meaning the father, was both severe and cruel in his punishments. I know of acts of barbarity, that means cruelty, from trustworthy people. The padre must have considered whipping like food for the Indians, for they had it morning, noon, and night. So what he's saying there is that the padre, the father, was, or the priest really, was whipping the Native Americans constantly. Although so severe to the Indians, he was kind in the extreme to other visitors. There being so much beef, mutton, pork, and poultry with fruits, vegetables, and wines that a splendid public table was spread daily, which he hosted. So this guy was rude and horrible, the padre, to the Native Americans that were in the mission system. But if they had visitors, whether it was a Spanish diplomat or somebody from maybe another country or somebody of higher status than he considered the Native Americans, well, then he'd get this whole spread of meat and fruit and vegetables apparently daily that he hosted for people. So he was nice to people of status, but he wasn't nice to the Native Americans because in his eyes, they didn't have status. I mean, that's basically what racism is, right? If you think somebody is less, then you don't value their status. So this is a more primary source than what we read in Document A, which was a secondary source. So this makes it sound like Native Americans were not treated well. They were whipped. They deserted because it was so terrible, and if they got caught, they were whipped some more, and that the Spanish had a very low tolerance and viewpoint of these Native Americans. So if you ask Document B, they're going to say, no, they were not treated well. Okay, go to Document C. Jean-François de la Perouse, I don't know how to say that really, I don't speak French. Jean-François de la Perouse was a French naval officer and explorer. He visited missions in Northern California in 1786 while on a worldwide scientific expedition. So this is a French explorer who comes to visit. Okay. Below is an excerpt from his journal about the mission at Monterey Bay. Now, for reference, Monterey Bay is not really in Northern California, but it's north central. It's north of where we are in San Pedro. Here's what he wrote in his journal about what happened at that mission in Monterey Bay. Everything reminded us of a West Indian slave colony. The men and women are lined up by the sound of a bell. One of the religious Spanish friars conducts them to their work, to church, and to all other exercises. And when they say exercises, they don't mean like in PE, they mean like activities. We mention it with pain. The resemblance, meaning the similarity, to a slave colony is so perfect that we saw men and women loaded with irons, that means wrapped up in chains, others in the stocks, that means like almost like a torture device, whether that's a torture rack or being hung in chains or maybe you've seen it before where somebody in the town square has their head and their hands put between that wooden board and they can't move. That's what a stock is. So they said, we saw men and women loaded with irons, others in the stocks, and at length the noise of the strokes of a whip struck our ears. This explorer comes to a mission and he says, this looks like a slave colony. He says, people are in chains, they're in stocks, and we hear whips constantly. That doesn't sound like Native Americans are being treated well. And these are Christians. These are Catholics. What is going on? You think people are going to be Christian or Catholic because you whip them? You're going to whip Christianity into them? It sounds like that was the case according to this document. That goes along with document B as well. So document A says, no, they were treated well, but B and C both say, no, they weren't treated well. C goes as far as to say, this looks like a slave colony. And this French explorer had been around the world. He'd seen slave colonies. And he says, that's what this looks like to me. Okay, keep reading. Document D, Julio Cesar. Julio Cesar was a Native American born at the San Luis Rey Mission in 1824. In 1878, historian Hubert Howe Bancroft interviewed Cesar about his life on the mission, which was later made into a book. Below is an excerpt from the interview. Okay, so this guy lived on a mission, Julio Cesar. He's being interviewed by a historian years later. So it's a primary source, but it's years after the fact. So just keep that in mind. When I was a boy, the treatment given to the Indians at the mission was not at all good. They did not pay us anything, but merely gave us food and a breech clout and blanket. Now, a breech clout is like shorts. I guess that's like clothing, and a blanket, which was renewed once a year. They flogged us for any fault, so they hit them for anything they did wrong, however slight meaning small or insignificant. So what he's saying is they would hit us no matter how small the thing or the offense was that they did. Not a great way to live. This sounds pretty terrible if you ask me. So if we step back here and look at our question, how were Native Americans treated in the California mission system, I don't know that we can really say that they were treated well. I think you have to be specific as to what that was. But on the other hand, I think it's important that we take into consideration that only one document said that they were treated well, and the rest, including that one painting, said that they were not treated well. So I want you to go into some specifics as to what that was, whether it was people were deserting the missions because they were afraid of what would happen to them, they were beaten, they were held in chains, they were whipped. Keep it simple. The other thing is this: you live where this happened. This happened in Southern California. It wouldn't surprise me if near San Pedro there is a mission, a former mission, somewhere around here. So just keep this in mind. This is your history. Some of you might literally be the ancestors of the people who experienced this. If you're, let's say, if you're of Mexican heritage, you're almost certainly the ancestor of somebody who this happened to. So this history affects you directly. If you are a black person living here, there's a chance that you have some connection to slavery, depending on your lineage. I don't know. This mirrors in a lot of ways the experience that slaves felt, not just here in the United States, but around the world, African slaves. So there are a lot of parallels here. This is something that affected your ancestors directly within the last 200-300 years. So this is not something to be taken lightly. I really look forward to reading your answers, and I hope that this sheds some light on the history of California for you and the problems of Spanish colonization and what this can do to a group of people.